This is the Awkward GM Corbin, and today we are doing part 2 of the strengths of being a mage in Mage the Awakening. Shout out to our patrons for supporting the channel. So now we move on to spellcasting, which is what mages are all about. There is down and dirty spellcasting rules for sort of mundane spellcasting or unimportant spellcasting, just so that the storyteller and the players aren't spending so much time trying to calculate how much dice to roll. You just roll your Gnosis plus Arcana and you can like change your hair or something if your storyteller says that that's a mundane action. On an exceptional success on your spellcasting roll, you regain 1 spent willpower and you can gain one of the following effects. You can refund all the mana that you spent on the spell that you just cast. You can gain an additional reach on the spell and adjust what you want to do. For instance, hit more targets or increase the duration of a spell. You can gain a condition that will give you arcane beats when it's resolved, or you can cause your spell to ignore the withstand of the target and allow the spell to take its full effect of potency on the target. So equivalent of you roll the dice and not only does your opponent not have to withstand it, your opponent is going to be hit with a potency 10 spell, probably. Double check me on that. Normally I wouldn't be talking about exceptional success rolls, but honestly, mages do get some interesting stuff when you roll exceptional successes on these more generic rolls or general rolls that all mages will have to do at some point. Now we move on to Praxis Spells, which are sort of spells you have mastered. I'm going to be very generic about this because we just care about the mechanics right now. Praxis Spells are spells that you get exceptional successes on 3 successes instead of the usual 5. They do not require a point of mana to cast from inferior or common arcana, but other costs may still apply. But they must be from an arcana your mage knows. So for instance, if you want to have a death spell be your praxis, you cannot take a death spell unless you have at least 1 dot of death in order to do so. Even then, it has to be one from the 1 dot death spell list. You can't take one from the 3 dot spell list. Rotes are spells that you've memorized or you have written down. If you cast a rote from a grimoire or it's one you designed, you gain the rote quality on the spellcasting roll. When casting from memory or orders recall techniques, you may use dots in an associated skill as a yantra. You are considered to have 5 dots in your highest arcana used to calculate how much reach you get for that spell, and you do not require to spend a point of mana to cast from an inferior or common arcana, but other costs may still apply. To reiterate, if you have a single spell that is both a praxis and a rote, when you cast it, you have to choose if it's being cast as a rote or a praxis. You can't use both effects at the same time as per the rules. Let me take a second to discuss with you what withstand is. Certain spells, when they're cast on an enemy, are withstood by the target. This means that the target has a stat, usually an attribute, that is resisting the spell. For instance, Grave Misfortune has a withstand that is the target's composure. Now, when a mage casts a spell, they need their potency to be above that withstand composure rating. If it's not, the spell fizzles and just doesn't affect the target. However, if the potency is above the target's withstand, the entire effect of the spell goes off without a hitch. It's not reduced in any way. Even if the potency is reduced down to 1, the full effect of the spell hits the target. Now, if you want to spend willpower to increase your withstand rating, akin to spending willpower to increase your defense by 2, which you can do normally, you can only spend willpower on your withstand if you're aware a spell is being casted on you, which means it's usually limited to only mages being able to do this because mages have peripheral mage sight that lets them know a spell is being casted on them. So now we talk about paradox and ways to mitigate paradox, which is a big strength of mages. For instance, paradox doesn't happen if your dice pool for paradox isn't increased. So if you don't overreach, if you don't cast a spell in front of a sleeper, at least not vulgarly, the paradox dice pool doesn't increase, and therefore you don't have to roll your paradox dice. One way to mitigate this is by spending a reach in order to cast spells at sensory range, which means that so long as, even if a sleeper is around, so long as the spell effect isn't inherently magical, like it can't be observed as being magical, it still doesn't provoke paradox. If you do cast a thrown spell and there are no sleepers around, you still don't provoke paradox. You can calculate paradox, and when calculating paradox, if you have a dedicated magical tool being used, you have a -2 to your paradox dice pool, and you can spend 1 point of mana to reduce the paradox dice pool by 1 paradox die. I have to make special mention of Clash of Wills. Whenever a Clash of Will happens, mages are always aware of it, unlike other supernatural creatures. Clash of Wills typically result in 2 spell-like effects counteracting each other or interacting in a way that the storyteller isn't really sure which one wins out. Big one is celerity. If there's an ability that allows an opponent to go first and another opponent has a similar ability, you roll a Clash of Wills to determine which one wins out. For mages, if they have spent additional reach to use the advanced duration or advanced potency reaches, it gains additional bonuses in Clash of Wills when that spell clashes. There's also a thing called Dispellation, spells that remove an active spell or supernatural effect. There is Counter Magic, which is different from Dispellation because it stops a spell from being cast before it takes effect. This takes up a future instant action if a mage is using active mage sight when they're using counter magic. Usually counter magic is something that happens during combat. It's not something that's going to happen outside of combat unless someone's casting spells, of course. In which case you should have your active mage sight up to see what spells being thrown at you so that you can counterspell it. There are touch spells, which are when you cast a spell normally, instead of like casting it at someone at range, you just have to touch them. And that's actually the main way mages can cast spells without spending any additional reach or mana or whatever to make it cast at range. Touch spells don't usually have a visible effect unless the spell that you're casting does. So for instance, if you're transforming someone into a different person and you touch them, that is a spell-like effect. That is vulgar magic. If there's a sleeper nearby, it provokes paradox. In order to do touch spells in combat, you need to roll a successful dexterity plus brawl or weaponry, because you could use your order tool or path tool as a yantra and you can tap someone with it, minus the target's defense in order to hit. You can also cast while grappling, but you suffer a -3 if you failed the grapple roll to cast the spell. And there's also limits on which yantras can be used. For instance, if you don't have access to your order or path tool, you can't use that in the grapple. If you take someone's order or path tool and you have it in your hand, you could probably use that. There's another thing that we have to talk about, which is relinquishing spells. You may spend 1 willpower point to relinquish a spell unsafely, which allows the spell to no longer count towards your active spell, but it has a chance to gain paradox-like effects as it's rolling around uncontrolled. You may spend 1 willpower dot to relinquish a spell safely, which allows the spell to no longer count towards your active spells and will safely finish if it reaches its duration, which can be indefinite, or it is dispelled. There are teamwork spellcasting roles where you have a secondary caster that adds their successes to the primary caster's dice pool. There's a -3 to the roll if the secondary spellcaster doesn't meet the arcana requirement of the spell. And sleepwalkers and proximi may be used as yantras in this way as a part of the teamwork roll. To discuss yantras for a little bit, yantras add a bonus to your spellcasting roll. Your spellcasting roll will be your gnosis plus the arcana of the spell that you're casting, and any yantras you have. Yantras can be used reflexively, but you can only use one reflexively that is not high speech, because high speech is singled out as not being able to be used reflexively. It has to be used over a long period of time. If you made it this far, thank you so much. Here's another video that is mage related, and I hope you have a good one.